Hey everyone, so we're going to be going through the main exam for MAAF119, which was the 2019 exam. So let's get on to question one. So a little bit of background knowledge for Fin exams is that there's no strict template to follow like in other subjects. It's more about reading the data, interpreting the data. So it's a lot harder to just apply a particular strategy. You really have to understand what you're doing, but there are some tricks that you can learn. So let's just quickly read through the background information. It's very important in this subject to make the most of your reading time in the exam and actually highlighting certain bits. If you can't actually pick up your highlighter during the exam, then actually using a fingernail or something like that just to underline key areas so you can come back and remember it, because reading it's going to be a big part in getting the answer right. As usual, I'm going to skip ahead and see what the question is first before I read through the content. So in this case, it's 11 marks in Part A. We have to analyze results from the dashboard, which is provided in Table 1 as an attachment. And then number 2, determine and justify 2 additional items that should be included in the dashboard to support the usefulness of the dashboard reporting for the CEO and the CFO. Okay, so let's read through the information. If you want to pause the video and read it, that's fine. I'll just pick out some of the key points that I can see as I go. Okay, so we know that it's a footwear company. And prior to 2015, they were one of the market leaders across Australasia. So that indicates they've had some sort of decline since then. So 60% of their shop fronts are located in suburbs where foot traffic has reduced over the last 5 years. So again, it's indicating trend. So just while we're going through this, just thinking, we're kind of anticipating what the data is going to show before we've looked at it. Because when we see it in the text, most likely we'll see it in the data, and then when we explain the data, we'll know that we'll have to use this text over here is the explanation why it's declined. So that might be a reason for why revenue might have declined, is that they haven't shifted online, but then their foot traffic or organic sales have dropped as a result. So they only operate shop fronts. Okay, there we go. So there's no online customer orders, so that's going to be directly linked into a reduction in foot traffic. There's an electronic survey for customers. Okay, so most other footwear retailers sell their products from shop fronts, but some also sell their products online. So this kind of suggests that they're not keeping up with competitors. Okay, so we're the business advisor, and we've picked up the following things. So number 1, online retail sales have significantly increased. So this is in the industry as a whole. Strong competition from department stores has forced footwear retailers to reduce prices. So there's downward pressure on prices in the industry. And department stores have extensively increased their footwear product range over the past 3 years. So there's a lot of competition from department stores, both in terms of price but also product as well. So there's trends in sports and athletics. The online-only retailers continue to expand their operations and have taken market share away from shopfront retailers. So again, just going back to that online issue, that the fact that this company hasn't got an online presence. So consumers have become more comfortable with purchasing products online. So purchase costs have declined over the past 3 years as footwear retailers have increasingly sourced products directly from cheaper overseas manufacturers. Okay, so the CEOs outlined the key success factors for active sports, which includes ability to control stock on hand, location of stores, and staff number in stores. Okay, so now let's have a look at Table 1, which is generally... Oh, here we go here. So I'm just going to rotate the PDF so you can see it. So we kind of already have an idea as to what to expect before we're actually looking at the numbers. Obviously, we're not going to know everything, but based on what the background is in the text, we should have a good idea. So, for example, we knew that there was going to be more competition from online retailers. So I'd expect revenue to be declining. Now, there's a few drivers why revenue is declining. Lessened foot traffic, more competition from the department stores, more presence of online retailers, and younger demographic wanting to shop online and things like that. So there's a few different points there already, and I can see that. So if we look at 2016, the revenue is $66.5 million, and in this year it's down to $62 million. So we can say fairly comfortably that there's a 3-year trend of revenue declining. So what else is there? Just staying on revenue, because obviously everything else is an expense now. If we look down here, we can see the demographics of the footwear industry. I can see that people aged 15 to 34 previously made up 30% and now make up a higher percentage of the industry demographic. And if you remember back in the text that we were talking about how younger people are more likely to shop online, so that could be a contributing reason, with a little bit of overlap with the online reason, but this is the shift in demographic to a demographic which is more likely to shop online. What about here? Retail footwear industry revenues. This shows you the total industry revenue for footwear. Now, your first response when we look at that is that they've given us this information, and they must have given it to us for a reason. They very rarely give us unnecessary information in the CA exam. So how can we use this industry data here? Well, one idea might be what's this company's share of market share? So if we do some quick maths and calculate the market share in 2016, which is 66 million over 3.28 billion, that's approximately 2% of the market share. In 2017, it's 64.3 mil over 3.442 bill. So that is approximately 1.86%. And in 2018, it was 62.048 million over 3.436 billion, which is equal to 1.8%. So there's a steady decline. I mean, we could have expected that without even seeing the numbers, based on what the background information they've given us in the text. But that's just another point that we can use, is that the market share has been declining. We can link that back to a few different things, including the increase in department stores and the increase in the online presence. So that's revenue. What about expenses? So cost of goods sold. So let's have a look. The main thing I want to look at cost of goods sold is the margin. And the reason I look at margin instead of the dollar amount is because COGS generally scales with your revenue. So we want to know, with any given comparable revenue, how has your cost of goods sold changed? Margin will tell us that because it's always against your revenue. So if you sell more, you're going to purchase more cost of goods sold. But what I want to know is, are you getting a better deal? So the margin here is changing from 50.2% to 48%. So the margin is actually decreasing. So this could be a good thing, actually. Our analysis has to be good and bad. So we can link that back to the point about how they were referencing that a lot of manufacturers or a lot of retailers are sourcing from cheaper overseas manufacturers. So that's going to be our point there, how that's having a deflationary impact on the COGS margins. Okay, what about wages? So how's wages? So wages are moving up. So there was a point in here in the earlier question about the CEO was mentioning the impact from putting more people, more staff in the stores. So that's basically the key driver there that we can reference to. Advertising. So the margin for advertising has increased quite dramatically from 0.3% of revenue to 1% in 2018. So what we can draw from that is, well, whilst there's nothing in the text particularly that explains that, what we can kind of draw from that is their extra spend in marketing hasn't actually resulted in an increase in revenue. The revenue is decreasing. So I mean, that can be our key takeaway, is that the marketing spend isn't being effective. Okay, so that's pretty much all we can really derive from that. There's other operating expenses increasing as well, but it's quite a generic category. There's nothing we can really talk about there. Okay, so let's go back to our exam paper and have a look at the marks. So analyze the results from the draft dashboard, 7 marks. So in terms of how we actually answer this, you get 7 marks. So I'd probably expect 7 different responses, 7 or 8. So to get those 7 points, we've kind of been through all the possible options there. So the points I would probably talk about is number 1, decline in revenue due to the growing online presence of online retailers, number 1. Number 2 is declining revenue due to greater competition from department stores. And you can reference how they're reducing their prices as well to be competitive. Number 3, I would talk about the younger demographic group being more comfortable purchasing online footwear and how that's driving negative revenue growth. Next, I would talk about the less foot traffic, and referencing here, try and reference exactly the wording that's in the text. So we can say that 60%, instead of just saying the shop fronts have had less foot traffic, say 60% of the shop fronts have had reduced foot traffic over the last 5 years, which is contributing to declining sales. I'd then just talk about either the demographic change, although we've already kind of mentioned that. I'd probably add on to that point about demographic just the data set that we had in table 1, where we can see that younger people are making up a larger percentage of the demographic. But what I would talk about for the last point of revenue, so this is the 5th point, is the declining portion, or the declining contribution of this entity, Active Sports, to the total footwear industry from X% to X%. So actually reference the numbers in there. Okay, so that's all of the points we talked about for revenue. Next, I would talk about COGS. So this is the 6th point. So COGS talking about how the use of overseas manufacturers has actually reduced the COGS margin over time from 50.2% to 48%. This is actually improving profitability despite revenue decreasing. And then we can talk about these 2 expenses. So that once we talk about those 2, that'll be 8 points. I probably wouldn't do more than that. I wouldn't do more than 7 or 8 points to get your full 7 marks. So wages and training, just referencing the fact that the CEO, let me bring it up here. Staff number in stores, here we go. So over the past 3 years, staff number in stores have increased to support the required personalised service. So that's driving the increase in cost, but it's not actually supporting an increase in revenue. It's actually making the business less profitable. And then finally, for the 7th mark, let's talk about advertising and how, whilst the spend is increasing, which is increasing from 0.3% of revenue to 1% of revenue, revenue has actually declined X% from 66.5 mil to 62.5. So that's how you get full marks for that question. Let's move on to part B, which is determine and justify 2 additional items that should be included in the dashboard to support the usefulness of dashboard reporting to the CFO and CEO. Okay, so this is only worth this is worth 4 marks. So we only need to give 2 items, and we need to provide, so it's going to be 2 marks for identifying the correct one, and 2 marks for justifying them correctly. Okay, so my first response would be let's go back to the text and actually think about what the CEO wants. So he's outlined here the key success factors for Active Sports. So there's 3 items in here. So I'd focus on addressing those first to be able to answer the question. So the first one he's mentioned is ability to control stock on hand. So what data in this table could we, that's not on here currently, could we use to potentially measure inventory levels? Well, from the core material, we could use some of the KPIs that we've learned, such as inventory days turnover. So that could be one, and the justification is this has been identified as a critical improvement factor by the CEO. So that's all we need to really answer to get 2 marks out of 4. Then the other thing we need to identify is one more thing that's not currently in there. So let's go back to that original list from the CEO. So we've got location of stores and staff number in stores. So the one that jumps out immediately as easy is staff number in stores. So we mentioned before how those staffing costs were increasing despite revenue declining. So they're saying what this is doing is it's actually increasing, it's just increasing the numbers to support the personalized service. So there's 2 things that I'd probably want to look at here. Is number one is, are customers actually getting personalized service, as the CEO says? Now I remember from the text up here it says that customers are asked to complete an electronic survey as they exit the store. The survey consists of 3 short answers. So this is one very important piece of information that's not being reported in the dashboard. So it's the actual rating that the customer's survey is giving the stores. This is like a direct feedback of the quality of service. So to answer that one, I'd probably put overall rating of the customer survey, and the justification is it's reporting on the customer feedback, which was the CEO's justification for increasing support staff costs in the store. So that's another 2 marks there, and that'll get us 4 out of 4. Some other potential things you could probably talk about is still on the same topic, but just talking about the revenue per employee. So I mentioned that the revenue is declining, but the employee numbers are up. So you could talk about just revenue per employee metric. Okay, cool. So that's the question 1A. Part 1, I should say. Part A. Okay, so part B. So it still feeds into the same question, but the annual budget preparation was initially delayed for the period. A draft to 31 December 2019. A draft budget, so in table 2, has now been prepared for the CFO, and you've been asked to review it. Okay, so we've got the following notes. So the retail footwear industry is expected to grow 1%. The industry's got low barriers to entry. The online sector of the footwear is expected to grow 10% for the budget year. No change in Forex. Spending on employee training is a high priority, because that supports positive customer in-store experience, which, if you remember before, was a key criteria for the CEO. 50% of active sports stores will have new rental agreements during 2019. No new stores are budgeted in 2019. Active sports to commence an online offering in 2019. Okay, so let's skip to the question, analyze the draft budget. Okay, number 1, 7 marks. It's a similar process to as we did above, but for the budget. And number 2 is, or B, I should say, the CEO queried why an incremental budget process was not used. Assess the appropriateness of applying an incremental budget methodology for the budget year. So here we have the budget over here. So what I want to do first of all is just really understand what's going on. And then I'll try and link back, because it's easy to forget, because these are the clues as to what you have to talk about. Always link back to these, extraordinary circumstances. So the low growth, the high competition, the employee training, the new rental agreements, no new stores, online offering. So first of all, let's just figure out what's going on with the budget. Like, really understand it, and then we can figure out what our points are. So number 1, revenue, really high growth, first of all, 6% year on year. But I can see that that's made up of organic growth in stores of 2.2%. It seems a little bit more reasonable, but still higher than the 1% that they were kind of talking about above. And then the online store offering up here. which we've got. So if they've got a new store, presumably all the expenses would have to increase as well. So I guess let's keep that in mind when we're going down here a little bit later on. So cost of goods sold, I'm a little bit surprised that it's declining, -4%. Whilst yes, they've got cheaper overseas manufacturers, but at the same time they're expecting their revenue to increase 6%. That's really a net decrease in their COGS of like 10% when you sum those two. So that just seems a little bit too optimistic, either the COGS or the revenue. Okay, so moving on to expenses. So rent at 0%. Straight away, that seems a little bit out of the ordinary. Normally, you'd have 1, 2, 3% increases with CPI. And then, of course, if you remember from the extraordinary facts, is that they're expecting that 50% of their stores are going to have new rent agreements. So that number just seems wrong. So there's a wage increase of 6%. Okay, so next, wages. I can see that the wages are increasing 6%, but that's actually lower than the revenue growth. So you always got to consider the expense increase relative to revenue, because as you open more stores, as you operate more services, you're going to need more staff. So you're not actually paying them more per hour. You're not actually investing in training, as they've said is a critical priority up here. That's purely just to cover the additional revenue generated. So this is actually goes against what their strategy is, which is to invest heavily in training. So next is advertising and marketing at 0%. This doesn't quite correlate with this revenue growth up here, or this revenue growth, or this new online store, because if you're going to open a new store, if you're going to grow new sales, you're going to have to spend more on advertising and marketing. So either that's incorrect or the revenue is too optimistic. So it's either one or the other. And then, what else? Website. Nothing really to comment on there. That's often a fixed cost, so a relatively small amount. So you'd probably expect it to increase a little bit, but it's not like a huge point either way. So that's pretty much it. So that's understanding what's going on. So in terms of talking about the point, let's just do a quick refresher of the key qualitative extraordinary facts. So forecast revenue industry growth is 1%, low barriers to entry, and the online sector is expected to grow 10%. No change in Forex. So I wonder why they gave us this one. And like I said before, they don't give us random information. There's always a purpose for the information. So just consider that. Don't just skip over it. Just think about where we can put this. Spending on employee training is high priority, so we talked about that. New rental agreements, we talked about that, about how the rent's not changing. No new stores are budgeted. Active sports commence an online offering during 2019. Okay, so keeping that in mind, what are the key points that we're going to talk about to get our, how many marks? 7 marks. So we want 7 points here. Okay, so first of all, let's talk about revenue. Okay, so the first thing that I'm going to talk about is probably this one. So let's just tick them off one by one. So the industry is expected to grow at 1%, whereas in our budget, we're budgeting, and this is our answer by the way, we're budgeting an increase of revenue at 6.5 to 3%. This seems way too optimistic. Even if we just only take into account our organic growth from stores of 2.27%, this is still more than double what the industry growth is expected to be. So likely the revenue is a little bit optimistic in the budget. As a separate point, we could also mention, like linking back to the first question, the decline in foot traffic and how that might mean the store's organic growth of 2.27% is a little bit optimistic considering foot traffic is declining. So I'd probably keep those as 2 separate points. Okay, so the next thing that I would talk about is the online store. So the online store, we've got $2.6 million of incremental revenue. but we haven't actually factored in any costs associated with that. For example, the website costs are flat. So you could either use this as a revenue point or an expense point. We'll leave it as a revenue point and just say that this is probably optimistic, but you could arguably also say the costs are understated for the website. Okay, a separate point about revenue is that the barriers to entry. So just bringing this up over here. So if we're expecting low barriers to entry for online competitors, the revenue growth might be a little bit optimistic. Okay, so how many points is that? That's 1, 2, 3, 4. That's 5 points so far. 5 points. We need 7 or 8 points to get the full marks. Okay, so let's try and get 3 points around expenses now, and then that should get us the full marks for this question. Okay, so rent first of all, that's an easy one. So rent, we said that there are 50% of stores will have new rental agreements, but the rental expense hasn't changed from prior year, which suggests that this is probably incorrect. Because if you're going to have new rental agreements, you're going to expect some sort of change. COGS, we forgot about COGS up here. So we mentioned before that if revenue is increasing 6% and COGS are declining 4%, that suggests that COGS are probably incorrect. So whilst there is some evidence in the question, so this is all part of your answer, right? You're showing all the different sides to it, and you're linking it back to the textbook. So, back to the original question. So whilst there is some evidence that COGS may be declining because of cheaper overseas manufacturers, suppliers, this is where we can actually link in the Forex. We can say that, well, there hasn't actually been any change in Forex rates, so this doesn't actually make sense. It's not explained by, Forex variation. So we probably think this is probably incorrect. Okay, so that's 2 expense items. And then finally, we can talk about wages and training, because we've already talked about advertising. So wages and training, which you can just mention that the fact that the costs are increasing at a slower rate than revenue does not align with the CEO's expectation of a high priority investment in employee training to support exceptional interpersonal skills. Cool, so that's pretty much it. That's how you get full, we listed 8 points. You need 7 or 8 points to get the full 7 marks. Okay, so the next one is, the CEO queried why an incremental budget process was not used. Assess the appropriateness of applying an incremental budget. So first of all, what is an incremental budget? So an incremental budget is basically, and it's in the MAAF critical notes under the budget section, but incremental budget is basically when you take last year as a baseline and then you just add a percentage. Okay? So you just go, last year's P&L plus 2% or 3%. So the CEO wants to know why we're not doing that. So generally, you wouldn't do this when there's some large structural changes. So some of the structural changes that we know are happening is, they're launching an online store. So that's probably the most major point there. But we probably need one other point as well, just because it's 2 marks, and there's no justify mark. It's just assess it. So another point that we can probably mention is that the other major expense items are also adjusted by structural things. For example, rent being impacted by new rental agreement. New spend on the, online store, employee training for wages and so forth. So you can all kind of group that into a single point. So they're going to be our 2 points. So number one is it's not appropriate for a situation where there's large structural changes occurring. In this case, the launch of the online sales store means that a incremental process would not be applicable given the change. And then the second point is the major expense categories are all impacted by structural changes as well, and then list the things I mentioned before. So the rental agreements, the training, and the online competitors and so forth. So that's it. So that's a full 9 marks that you can get, and that is the end of question 1. That's how you get 20 out of 20 for question 1. So not so hard. Okay, so let's wrap it up there, and we'll finish question 2 in the next video.